Welcome, everybody. We're going to wait a few more minutes and let more people join us. So we'll begin about 5:32. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to get started here in just about one more minute. We're trying to give some folks some time to join us. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicole Silva, and I'm a proud banana slug and a member of our strategic engagement team here at UC Santa Cruz. Thank you for joining us tonight. Our University Forum series focuses on the relevance of our research to the community and to social, economic, environmental, and political issues. The University Forum proudly features the impact of research conducted by the faculty of UC Santa Cruz. Tonight's speaker is Professor Chris Benner, speaking on solidarity economics. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few details about the event tonight. We're using a webinar tool, so there's no chat function. We will have an opportunity to answer your questions at the end of the program, and we invite you to submit your questions into the Q&A box at any time. And also, tonight's event will be recorded. We would like to thank the Institute for Social Transformation here at UC Santa Cruz for co-sponsoring tonight's event. The Institute for Social Transformation is embedded within the Division of Social Sciences. And joining us now is the Dean of Social Sciences, Catherine Mitchell, who will be giving us an update on the work the Institute is doing, as well as introducing tonight's speaker. Dean Mitchell joined UC Santa Cruz in August of 2017. She is a professor of sociology, and her current research explores the role of faith-based organizations in providing humanitarian aid and refuge to migrants. Welcome, Dean Mitchell.
Thank you, Nicole. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I hope that most of you in the audience are already familiar with the work of the Institute for Social Transformation. But if not, please do take a look at our new website, where you can get a good sense of the types of things that the Institute is working on these days. So our mission statement emphasizes supporting innovative scholarship that changes the world. We're also a critical intellectual and social hub. We connect scholars across UC Santa Cruz, but also with partners beyond the university, developing research-based solutions to urgent problems in the world. Just to give you a couple examples of the types of partnerships that we have supported, I can point to the creation of a human rights investigation lab for the Americas by Silvana Falcone, who's our Associate Professor of Latin American and Latino Studies. Dr. Falcone's Human Rights Investigations Lab for the Americas partners with legal, advocacy, and media partners in need of open source investigative work related to human rights cases. She and the undergraduate and graduate students she engages work with Amnesty International's Digital Verification Corps to train a new generation of human rights investigators on discovery and verification methods. So we've also supported Dr. Flora Liu's project, Transformations to Groundwater Sustainability, Centering Community and Human Groundwater Interactions in the Pajaro Basin. Dr. Liu is a professor of environmental studies, and this project consists of an interdisciplinary collaboration of scholars and practitioners to address the political ecology of groundwater in the Pajaro Basin. They are committed to integrating diverse practices and knowledge about groundwater management, including current understandings of contemporary groundwater law and policies, land use histories, and everyday practices. The project seeks to foreground the voices and the experiences of community members, especially those who are underrepresented in policymaking. So those are just two examples of the kinds of partnerships we support in the Institute. And we support them financially, but also in terms of helping them make connections and partnerships and providing the space where people can meet. And we also have a staff that helps to support people with coordination and various kinds of logistics. So also I wanted to tell you about a really exciting recent event, a major gift where the Institute, as a result of the gift, has been able to begin a new project that I'm really excited about. It's called Building Belonging. And it's a 5-year effort designed to increase undergraduate engagement and build a greater sense of belonging through conducting research projects with faculty. This program provides undergraduate students with $1,500 fellowship awards in which they can engage with faculty in the terms of their research. Making these opportunities paid rather than volunteer opens them up to students who have limited financial means. The program is available to all undergraduates at UC Santa Cruz, but first generation, low income and underrepresented groups and former foster youths are especially encouraged. Finally, one of the truly wonderful things that the Institute for Social Transformation has been able to accomplish, which I didn't foresee initially, is that it has been able to move really quickly to share information, something especially critical in the current climate where something new seems to be happening every single day. So for example, the Institute team, which includes Director Chris Benner, as well as our Assistant Director, Mikhail DeSupolo, our Director of Operations, Evan Knight, and our Communications Director, Andrea Limas, has been able to immediately link people to what's going on with respect to our campus research on COVID-19. And we were able to set up an anti-racism and criminal justice reform website within 10 days of George Floyd's death and the ensuing protests. So now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Chris Benner. Professor Benner is the Dorothy E. Everett Chair in Global Information and Social Entrepreneurship and a professor of environmental studies and sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He currently directs the Everett Program for Technology and Social Change and the Santa Cruz Institute for Social Transformation. Dr. Benner's research examines the relationships between technological change, regional development, and the structure of economic opportunity, focusing on regional labor markets and the transformation of work and employment. His most significant books include Equity, Growth, and Community, which examines the diversity and dynamics of regional knowledge communities and the relationship to social equity and economic growth. And Just Growth, which helps uncover the processes and institutional arrangements that help explain how certain regions around the country have been able to consistently link prosperity and inclusion. So we'll go now to Dr. Benner's presentation. Chris?
Great, thank you, Dean Mitchell. And I've just done the hardest part of the night, is making sure that technology works. My PowerPoint presentation is hopefully up. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. And I look forward to your question and answers, and I hope you will, as we go through the talk, put your questions into the Q&A function in the webinar. But what I want to talk to you tonight is about this concept of solidarity economics. And how we can learn from this moment of crisis in the coronavirus and what it means for really the future of our society. And I want to start by giving an example of Ethiopia. I just learned recently, actually, about what's quite a remarkable experience that Ethiopia has had in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And those of you who are my age may remember, and others have read about it in the history books, that in the 80s, Ethiopia was really literally a poster child of global poverty and famine, and really a desperately poor country. And you look today at these charts here on the level of incidence of COVID-19 per capita, per million population. And, the United States, these are figures just from today, is almost 7,000 people per million population. It's quite remarkable to think about. We have 4% of the world's population and over 25% of the world's confirmed COVID-19 cases. And, we hear a lot about European countries, Italy, France, and Germany. They've been able to really flatten the curve while the US has not been able to flatten it really at all. We hear about New Zealand, how successful they've been, but we hear very little about places like Ethiopia, which is one of the cases in the continent of Africa with the fewest incidence rate of COVID-19. And Ethiopia is actually quite a remarkable country. It's the second largest country in Africa, the second busiest airport after Johannesburg, lots of Chinese investment, about 107 million people. And it's a place where you could imagine COVID-19 really taking off in many of the poor neighborhoods and informal settlements. And yet its level is only 39 per million people. And Vietnam is really another interesting case. And I point to Ethiopia because it has provided some really interesting examples of what we need to be thinking about in this coronavirus, and this notion of moving from charity and responding to the problems of the moment to solidarity. So in the 80s, people may know Bob Geldof. He was a rock star, the Boomtown Rats. He launched what was called at the time Band Aid, which was the first effort really at charity, celebrity charity, and trying to raise money for the famine in Ethiopia, Feed the World. And he and a whole group of other artists, including Sting, David Bowie, Paul McCartney, Bono, Phil Collins, Boy George, essentially everyone who was anyone in the British and Irish pop music scene, to record this hit single, Do They Know It's Christmas, which shot to the top of the charts in the UK as a way of raising money for famine relief in Ethiopia. But what's important is they didn't do the hard work of looking at the underlying causes of hunger in Ethiopia, and really just charity threw money at the problem. It's interesting, over time, Bob Geldof has come to see the error of those ways, to really understand the deeper problems of poverty in Africa, and realize that it doesn't have to do just with lack of production of food. It has to do with the lack of diverse economy. And he's recognized now that Ethiopia is a tremendous opportunity for economic growth. In fact, Ethiopia has the most rapidly growing economy in the world over the last 15 years, and one of the lowest levels of inequality, a growing manufacturing export base. But what's important is what Ethiopia was able to do to respond to the coronavirus crisis. One is it responded very early in January, started testing international travelers to the airport in Addis Ababa, but it built on a strong prevention-based primary public health care system in which there was a coordinated response to the COVID-19 pandemic that was centered not on trying to understand how many ventilators the country had, because they knew it's a poor country. They had to start with public awareness and education and really helping people. And so they've been able to prevent the kind of economic shutdown that the US has experienced. And the predictions at this moment is that Ethiopia is going to continue to grow during the pandemic at a time when the US economy is likely to see a major economic shock this year that we're already experiencing. And so when we think about the US in the pandemic, in many ways, we might be the Ethiopia of the 2010s, of the 2020s. Hunger is really taking off in the midst of the pandemic. People never seen anything like it. The cars in line waiting for the food banks. We're at a point now where 40% of mothers with children 12 and under are experiencing already food insecurity, including the children themselves, almost 1 out of 5. So what can we learn from that experience of Ethiopia? Well, the disease has revealed our underlying sickness. So it's important for us to really think about how do we understand and analyze it in a way that can lead us in a better direction going forward. So part of that underlying sickness is the tremendous inequality we face as a country. It's now the highest level of inequality that we've ever experienced in our recorded records of total income, with over 50% of total income in the country going to the top 10% of income earners. And a full 46% of Americans are living right on the economic edge. They can't access $400 in an emergency. And what's particularly striking to me is we have this image of poverty being a long-term chronic experience. But the truth is many people, in fact, 80% of Americans will experience poverty at some point in their life, at least one full year of poverty or joblessness. Of course, our healthcare system is a major problem. 28 million people without health insurance and another 44 million more with inadequate health insurance. And particularly with our job-based health insurance system, those that become unemployed in the midst of a pandemic all of a sudden lose their health insurance just at the time when they need it most. And of course, the racial disparities in our crisis, we're beginning to fully understand the dimensions of this. And just to provide some data, this is from California COVID-19 cases. The Latino population is 39% of the California population, but 57% of cases, and experiencing the same number of deaths, despite the fact that the median population of the Latino population is about 20-25 years less than the white population. And if you look at African Americans, 6% of the California population, 5% of incidences, but 9% of deaths disproportionately experience death from COVID-19. And also particularly impacted by the economic crisis. So unemployment rates, and this is a measure of sort of an expanded unemployment rate that includes people who are not in the labor force and want a job, as well as those who are absent from a current job waiting to be recalled. And it jumped for the white population from 8% in February to 20% in May. That's actually a slight improvement from April. But for the Black population, nearly 30%, and the Latinx population, similarly 28%, as well as the Asian population. And it's also hit small business owners who are small businesses owned by people of color, particularly dramatically as well. About 11% fewer white self-employed business owners are operating as of May, but it's 26% less for African American, 19% less for the Latinx population. I should mention these figures are from economics professor Rob Fairley, who's on the executive board of the Institute for Social Transformation. So with those kind of underlying sicknesses in our society, what can we learn about our economics and solidarity economics going forward that can provide lessons for us going ahead? And that's really what I want to present tonight, is a project that we're launching actually basically now. We'll have a new website up by July or early August, in partnership with the Equity Research Institute at the University of Southern California. It's run by a long-term colleague and friend of mine, Manuel Pastor, a former professor in Latin American and Latino studies here at UC Santa Cruz, and also a graduate of UC Santa Cruz. And what we're trying to do in this project is take an approach that takes seriously the economic benefits of human impulses for connection, community, belonging, and as part of that, really centering race and racial inequality, but also the geography of opportunity and inequality and the way that power shapes the economy and opportunity in the economy overall. And we're doing this in collaboration with organizers, power builders, advocates, change makers, to really help think about and hopefully rethink our basic theories, our basic narrative, and policies about how we talk about and think about our economy. And so in introducing that project, I want to start by having you all think about the power of an economic frame. You know, you can think about, is the glass half empty or half full? It's the same reality, but the way that you look at it and think about it changes the way we understand what's going on in the world. And our goal, really, our modest goal, is to really think about new economic frames that can help us rethink economic theory, think about the policies that shape our economy, and think about how we talk about the economy. Because, you know, that very frame, how we look at things and think about things, structures our perceptions and also our actions in the world. And of course, those actions then feed into our institutions of government and the economy and corporations, as well as the social norms about how we relate to each other. And so if you think about sort of the traditional competing frames in the economy, it's this market versus government, essentially. And, you know, a neoliberal market frame sees the importance of free markets and efficiency as part of that, of individual freedoms, and the importance of deregulating markets to promote economic opportunity. And on the other side are the social democratic frame, the importance of government in ensuring macroeconomic stability and providing bailouts in the midst of crises, and providing government protection, and providing public goods and services and a social safety net to those who are left out. But what's problematic about that competing frames is that there's no place in there for values and connections. And we need to talk more about values in our economy. And if you think about it, values are deeply embedded in the market. And those can be positive values or negative values. And so, for example, you know, we have regulated different pricing tiers for our utilities, for energy and water. So you pay more for the more you use. And the goal of that is to incentivize conservation. That's a government intervention into the market. But think also about sports leagues. Anybody who follows sports knows that many sports leagues have systems of revenue sharing from television to redistribute from wealthy markets to less wealthy markets. They have a system where the teams that do the worst every year get to draft first, so they get better players to help equalize competition, because they recognize that limiting inequality makes everyone do better. But even in our basic markets, I mean, if you think about a farmer's market, there's a set of values that prioritizes local producers and direct farmer to consumer connections. Or even in grocery stores, I mean, even the widely publicized case in the last week of getting rid of the Aunt Jemima marketing on maple syrup. I mean, that was a value of a stereotype that was embedded in a product, and contrast that with organic or fair trade certification. They're very values that are embedded in the marketing of every items in our market. And similarly in government, I mean, government can be a source of a social safety net and protecting the most vulnerable in society, but it's also a source for policing and repression and imprisonment, depending on sort of who you are and where you are in society. And so as we think about these values, part of what we can recognize is both of those competing frames in many ways share a similar view of human nature. People act in their self-interest. That's, you know, literally built into the fundamental theories of economics, of self-interested, utility maximizing individual actors in the economy. But it's also built in many ways implicitly in the approach to government and social welfare, and that the government's role is to regulate the problematic self-interest of actors in the economy. But in fact, we know that people also act out of solidarity and mutuality with their family, with their neighbors, with their friends. And part of what we're trying to say is that the economy itself, we want it to be more built on solidarity and mutuality. But in fact, when you understand many of the dynamics that are going on in the economy in this descriptive way, in fact, cooperation is very important for economic activity and economic success. And I point there to a couple of books that help make that case. And part of what Manuel and I are trying to do is make the argument that if we can scale and strengthen solidarity, it would benefit people and the planet and prosperity for all. So that's the central concept. And, you know, now this is the part of the talk where if you were listening to a podcast, you'd have it all of a sudden shift into 1.5 times speed. Because what I want to try and do now is sort of go through a whole series of arenas of the economy where this principle of solidarity economics, if we understand it and apply it, it helps us understand both how the economy works and how it can be better for both prosperity and people if we invest in that solidarity. So first, there's a growing set of research out there, and Dean Mitchell pointed to some of my work with Manuel that helps document this, that those places that are more equitable in fact grow faster. And we did this with looking at metropolitan regions in the US, showing that income inequality was the single largest factor in reducing or derailing sustained growth. And there's similar research done by the International Monetary Fund and the Federal Reserve documenting this in other contexts. But in addition to the fact that equity can and does contribute to growth, part of what we find in our research on metropolitan regions in the US is that the places that have these beneficial dynamics don't necessarily have a silver bullet of the redistributive policy, but they have some set of institutions. Some of it has to do with metropolitan or government or cooperation between local government. Some of it's driven by nonprofit organizations or business entities in which it brings together diverse constituencies in some kind of process that's about generating information and knowledge about what's going on in the community. And those diverse and dynamic epistemic communities, we think, contribute to that economic growth. And those regions are able to sustain those epistemic communities through a recognition of a common destiny in the region, sort of deep roots, and a commitment to ongoing relationships across those differences and letting truth and reason rather than ideology drive those conversations. So there's evidence there. Second, solidarity and the caring economy. You know, people don't realize, but in fact, you know, healthcare and the caring economy more generally is an essential part of our overall economy. And some of the lowest paying jobs in home healthcare and nursing homes and some of the most dangerous places in the coronavirus, as we've seen. And if we would invest more in that caring economy, we could help improve dynamics there. California is growing older. By 2060, nearly a quarter of the California population will be 65 years and older. And already we have more people employed in nursing, elder, family, home health, and child care services by a large margin than all of the high-tech services in the state as a whole. So caring for the caring economy would have economic benefits overall as well, increasing wages and economic opportunity in that sector. And part of what we recognize in that is the notion in the healthcare industry that prevention is cheaper than treatment. If you get people to take their pills, it's cheaper than a kidney replacement surgery. And you know, broadly, there's a growing effort in this country, and the Bay Area is one of the leaders on that, to try and focus on these upstream factors of social inequities and institutional equities and broad living conditions that create the context that helps explain health outcomes. And when you look at the research and data on this in terms of health outcomes, you know, in fact, that clinical care, you know, is perhaps 20% of what can explain different health outcomes in terms of length of life and the quality of that life while people are alive. And it's this combination of physical environment and the social and economic factors, as well as health behaviors, that help explain that outcome. And we as a society, when you combine what we spend on healthcare with what we spend on social care, social services, you know, are roughly middle of the pack of all the other wealthy countries, but we spend a vast amount more of it on our healthcare system in a highly inefficient system, and much, much less on social care. So again, if we invested more in that preventative care and really, as part of this public health principle, took care of everyone so that all would be healthy, we'd end up with less expenses on healthcare overall and better health outcomes. So we also think about solidarity and the environment, non-human species. And, you know, as I think we've all come to realize, climate change is expensive, much less undermining the potential for different life on the planet. And this is just a measure from NOAA about the number of events every year that cost at least $1 billion in disasters. And it could be severe storms, it could be drought, flooding, wildfires, of course, which we know very well in California. And what's important about this is that many of the people in Wall Street and investors are realizing, in fact, fossil fuels is a bad economic bet at the moment. If you look about what we need to try and preserve increased temperature on the planet in some kind of reasonable level, in fact, we can only release another 473 gigatons of CO2 compared to the nearly 3,000 gigatons of proven fossil fuel reserves, suggesting that 84% of the fossil fuels that we already know about, and many of the oil and fossil fuel companies have written into their asset sheets, cannot be burned. And so the University of California is one of those institutions that has divested from fossil fuels, not because of concern for the planet from what they say in their policy, but because it's a bad economic bet. And that's what we see in Wall Street overall. But it's important also to recognize the things we have learned from the environmental justice movement, that, you know, the environment is the air we breathe every day. It's the water we drink. It's the workplaces and how healthy they are. And one of the things that's really clear is that part of what explains the disparate health outcomes in the coronavirus is concentration of communities of color and low-income communities in places where they are exposed to bad air quality and toxics in the water and air. And so, you know, centering equity is key to tackling both climate change and the environment overall, as well as the coronavirus crisis. So how about housing, solidarity and housing? And here I want to point to another international example of Hong Kong and Singapore, another place that's been relatively successful in the coronavirus crisis. Back in the 1960s, both Hong Kong and Singapore had a per capita GDP that was 1/5 or 1/4 of what the United States was at that time. Both of them embarked on a major investment in affordable housing subsequent to that time. And now in Hong Kong, over 40% of the population lives in publicly subsidized housing. In Singapore, it's over 90% with a mix of both home ownership and rental populations. And both Hong Kong and Singapore have become wealthier than the US on a per capita basis when adjusted for cost of living, as well as vastly surpassing the world as a whole. And the security of a place to live in an affordable level is a key part of the success of both places, because that contributes to entrepreneurialism and risk-taking, because people have that security of a place to live. In the US, we actually subsidize housing also, but in a very distortionary way, in which we provide subsidies to homeowners through a mortgage interest deduction, real estate tax deduction that's open to anyone, but is disproportionately benefiting white populations, because the white population has greater access to down payment and resources to be able to get into homeownership. Whereas for low, and those are mostly upper and middle income populations, whereas we provide very little resources relatively for low income renters. There's a long, long waiting list for people to get rent vouchers, Section 8 vouchers as a whole. And, you know, some studies have shown that the constrained housing supply just in 3 metropolitan areas of New York, San Francisco, and San Jose over this time period from '64 to 2009 has lowered the GDP in the country as a whole, not just those regions, of somewhere between 3.7 and 8.9%. So the lack of access to affordable housing is holding back our economic opportunity as a whole, not just for the people who are not able to get access to housing. And it's the result of housing policies, but it's also the result of homeowners' NIMBYism, not in my backyard. So again, it's this combination of social norms as well as government policies. And just to point again, the intersections between the economy and our health, in California, Cal Matters has done this really interesting study looking at levels of extreme overcrowding, households where there are more people than rooms, not bedrooms, but than rooms, and showing this really strong correlation between the places that are more crowded also having a higher incidence rate of COVID-19. Education, just as another area, we know that investing in education helps the economy. When you look at the statistics around it, it's quite remarkable. In California as a whole, just increasing the graduation rate from high school from 82% to 90% could result in over 3,000 new jobs, more than $2 billion in home sales, $550 million in additional earnings, an increase in $1.2 billion in GDP. So we should be investing in our public health system more. We also should be investing in adult education. When you look at how little we spend, it's about 2.2% of our GDP on what's called active labor market policies. These are adult training programs compared to other wealthy countries in Europe. You know, we're 1/10 of what Denmark spends and 1/8 to 1/10 of other countries as well. And that's a big drag on our economic performance as people get laid off from declining sectors and don't have the training they need to get rehired in new sectors. And then, you know, of course, the issue that's very much in mind of all of us today is about public safety. And, you know, what is it that really makes us safe? We spend a tremendous amount in this country on policing and the criminal justice system. And in California, across all local, county, and state, we spend about $40 billion. It's compared to only $18 billion for higher education. And that includes about $65,000 per year for every prisoner in our prisons in California. And that's been the result of really accelerating in the 70s and 80s of a increased policing process in California, leading the country as a whole. And in the country as a whole, we have the largest incarceration rate of all countries in the world, 655 prisoners per 100,000, including compared to many countries that we think of as being more repressive. And this list doesn't have North Korea because they're sort of outside of the international statistics, but the best estimates are at the moment that North Korea has about 250 prisoners per 100,000 population. So I want to emphasize that we have 2.5 times the imprisonment rate of what's arguably the most repressive country in the world. But what's important about that too is it's not just our public sector imprisonment rate, because we also have private security guards and a whole set of apparatus that goes along that too. And we have a level of protective services, including all those private security guards, that's again 3 to 4 times many other wealthy countries. And there's a very strong relationship between the level of inequality in our society and the extent to which we employ people in protective services in what's not a productive occupation in the terms of making something or producing new services. Is just protecting what exists. So it's a real drag on our economic performance. And so finally, just talking about sort of the factors shaping economic growth and innovation. And here's to recognize that a key part of innovation in our society is rooted in collective knowledge. And that's true in basic public sector investment in research and development. The economist Mariana Mazzucato is one of the people strongly arguing this and showing the ways, for instance, in this example, that nearly every major technology in the iPhone can trace its origins to public sector investment, the Department of Energy, National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, as well as Defense, DARPA, and others. And if you think about many of the major platform or network-based or software-based companies in the technology sector, part of the value is us searching on Google, which improves their algorithms, liking things on Facebook, which again improves their algorithms. And in fact, just being part of those networks, like of Uber and Lyft and others, increases their value, because when everyone's in the same platform, it makes the service faster and more comprehensive than it was in a fragmented area in those network economies. So we have a collective contribution, a solidarity contribution to our economic growth, but we don't recognize that. In fact, we let the private sector companies capture the rewards from that in what have become winner-take-all markets in these networked economies. And we can see across the economy overall, increasing market concentration and a declining return to labor as we see increasing return to ownership and investors on Wall Street, and driving that tremendous inequality that we experience in this country. And as a result, we're seeing a declining public investment in fundamental research and development over time. And we're falling behind major other wealthy countries in the world in terms of overall research and development that combines both public sector and private sector. So again, if we recognize this collective contribution to economic growth and invested in it and supported in it and redirected the resources that have resulted in wealth to investment over time in new R&D, it would help increase economic growth. And I think it's important to also then think about our social safety net programs and reconceptualize them as a social wage. That it's not just taken care of in the form of charity, as the Ethiopian case is, in fact, investing in everyone having the resources they need to be successful in our society, whether that's through affordable housing, higher education for all, more dense communities where people have access to opportunity, even an unconditional basic income. That's about solidarity, investing in the growth of our economy overall and providing opportunities for growth for everyone. So, as a final kind of wrap up before moving to your questions, is to also recognize that realizing this vision of solidarity economics won't happen without some kind of level of struggle, appealing to this notion of solidarity in more of a traditional political sense, because there are some companies and some people who are doing quite well in our current economy. Thank you very much. And we can lift up those examples of high road businesses that are really taking care of stakeholders, not just shareholders, and stressing the importance of empathy and caring for others and spreading these norms of taking care of the least among us. And that's important, but it's not enough. We also need to be tackling concentrated wealth and power, and really thinking about wealth taxes and how do we break up monopolies. We need to be challenging directly the racism in our society and other forms of domination, and reverse those historical systems of inequity, and really practicing solidarity as part of building movements across constituencies, across ideologies, and across geographies of this country, urban and rural, coastal and middle of the country. That's all got to be part of our solidarity economics. And so, I hope in this presentation I've sparked some ideas. I want to leave you with this final slide of a way of thinking about solidarity economics. And one of the central precepts of it is the way we talk about our economy. And I really try as much as possible to use the term our economy rather than the economy. As I've tried to do that, it's made me realize how deeply embedded the economy has become in our lexicon. But if we start talking about our economy, it makes it clear that we're constructing it. And it raises that question of, well, who is the we, and how is our economy different from other economies around the world, and what can we do to create a better economy for us that we think links this issue of growing. We need to have a growing economy, but that's growing together and growing in sustainable ways, and that's connecting marginalized communities with those better off communities, and really thinking about securing livelihoods and the future of people on the planet, not just dealing with short-term crises that we may be facing in the moment. So I really look forward to your questions, including particularly ones that challenge the framework, because we only get smarter when we think more deeply about these issues. If you're interested in more information about the Solidarity Economics Project, you can go to transform.ucsc.edu, our website, as well as sign up for our newsletter there for more information. And with that, I'll stop sharing the PowerPoint and look forward to Catherine sharing your questions with me.
Thanks so much, Chris. It was a really stimulating talk, and I learned a lot. And I'm the questions are just rolling in, so I am going to ask you the first one, and I think it relates back to the chart that you showed that the economist Rob Fairley had done with the disparities, racial disparities of COVID-19. And the question is, isn't the disparity, do the types of jobs that Latinx have, for example, thinking about the hospitality industry or other sort of essential kinds of work?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And that's, of course, part of the reason, but it's also a key illustration of this academic concept of intersectionality. Because it is true that the Latinx population in California and people of color more generally are in jobs that make them more susceptible, often service sector with a lot of interaction with other people, not so much in a more protected office environment. But they also tend to live in more crowded housing, more dense neighborhoods. They tend to be more exposed to some of the environmental issues that I talked about. And thus have sort of lower health resilience more generally. What I was pointing to of the public health approach, of the importance of looking at those broader social conditions of health, helps explain the vulnerability that communities of color have in this country. Greater dependence on public transit. There's some research still going on to try and get extent of the which COVID-19 has spread in mass transit and buses and subway systems. So all of those factors we think help explain in some ways the greater incidence rate of COVID-19 in communities of color. And I think, again, it just points to this issue of, if we'd started from that point back in January when we first had the warning signs that this was, the case, we could have paid attention to how do we ensure safety in those workplaces and really work to, mobilize the masks and the other protective equipment for those communities. We spent a lot of time worrying about ventilators, and it's not that ventilators aren't important, but if we're getting to the point where we need more ventilators than we have, we've already missed all those upstream causes that we should be intervening in to try and prevent the spread of COVID-19.
Yeah, thank you. Here's another question. How does this concept of solidarity economics draw from indigenous lifeways and ways of knowing? Related to that, how is this pervasive hyper-individualism a reflection of settler colonialism in the US?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And so settler colonialism, of course, underpins everything in our country, and I would say arguing much of European history as well. You really can't explain our economy without understanding the theft of land and the attempted genocide that was part of that in the Americas. And of course, slave labor was a key part of building that as well. And I think the built-in inequalities that are systemic across so many aspects of our economy can trace their roots back to that as well. If you think about sort of indigenous epistemologies during that time, and we know this from some of the populations I've worked with in Africa as well as indigenous Americans, people live in with a much deeper relationship with the environment and with each other. And part of that was because of a dependence on each other in an economy that didn't have the technological developments that our modern economy has. But we're learning more and more, including here in Santa Cruz, about the ways that our ecosystem was managed for thousands of years by indigenous communities before the Spanish first and Mexican and then white European settlers in this area. And so, I think a key part of what we're trying to recover in solidarity economics is definitely appealing back to some of the lessons of those voices that have been historically marginalized, really looking forward to what are the lessons that we need to take forward today in a globally connected, technologically advanced economy and society. And it's not about going back, it's about learning from history, figuring out how that history shapes our contemporary dynamics today, and then what are the lessons we can take forward. And that, that's part of why I engage a lot in innovation in the tech economy in Silicon Valley, because I mean, I like technology when it's used effectively and appropriately, and I think it becomes a great way of building global solidarity and global connection. And so, you know, I'm certainly not an anti-technologist in any way, but I do think we can learn from those, deep histories that have been denied us, to figure out what are those lessons that, you know, certain populations have carried forward in these subaltern communities throughout this time. And so we need to help lift up those voices and learn from those voices as we all figure out how to move ahead.
Thanks, that's a great answer. I think there's a sort of a connected question that a couple people have asked to your answer there, which is a question about growth. I think, you know, you talk about liking technological innovation, and we live in a capitalist society. And is growth necessary given those two processes? The questions are kind of, why is promoting growth an aspirational goal? Like, why do we have to have that as part of the starting point? Can we achieve more equality without growth? Aren't there limits to growth? And another person says, what does the term growth even refer to? Is it sustainable? So there's definitely an interest in the audience of around this question of, is it possible what you're advocating, is it possible with a growth model, which is essentially a capitalist model?
Right. Well, and I really love this question, and would love to have another 2 hours to sort of deal in depth with it. But let me raise, I think 3 things. So one is, our notion of growth in our society is dominated by GDP. And that's an incredibly narrow understanding of growth. And it's true, we should probably stop talking about that term growth and think about it in much more in terms of well-being, in which we're taking account of both, you know, monetary and non-monetary aspects of that, and really building in metrics that look at distribution, not just averages, because of course that's a really critical thing. And there are economists, and I would point to the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, that is really trying to think through, you know, how do we get top level statistics that can be produced by our government agencies that give us a much more complete understanding of well-being and sort of the improvement in economic well-being. And there are various other efforts to try and account for economic bads, environmental destruction, as well as unpaid labor as a part of that. And I would point to something called the Redefining Progress Index as one effort to do that. So I think that's an important set of issues. I think the second set of issues, though, is I do think it is valuable to have an economy that is producing greater opportunity for well-being, and often that is material well-being for many, many people, if we understand that in that full level. And it's easier to deal with inequality and the political dynamics of redistribution and reprioritizing if you're in an economy that's leading to greater material well-being than in ones that's shrinking. And there is a very strong degrowth movement in the world. From my understanding of it, that degrowth movement is strongest in wealthy countries. And I think when you look at poor countries around the world, people want an improved material well-being. They want greater access to electricity and water and economic opportunity. And so I think we need to figure out how to improve that economic well-being. And one of the things that I think is important in thinking about that, and this is the third point, is we have seen, even in our narrow measure of GDP, gross domestic product, some increasing separation between material resource use and economic output. As we get more services, less manufacturing base, that we can see that disconnection. And I can imagine, in theory, an economy that has a fully circular economy, where you're accounting for, all the recycling and reuse of materials and accounting for all that waste, that can continue to improve material well-being over time for at least a certain period of time. Now, empirically, that's a question about how we get there. But I think that's part of what we need to be thinking is a circular economy, building well-being, not just growth, but part of that is attention to the poorest in society as we're developing better metrics about what we mean by well-being, not just growth.
Thanks for that. I feel like I'm shooting these questions. If you want to take a glass of, have a sip of water, please go
Oh,
ahead.
I'm loving these questions. People are engaged. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so here's a question that I think refers to sort of the middle part of your talk when you were talking about investing in different kinds of programs. And the person's interested in whether you mean public or private investment, because there are institutions that have a social impact or social responsibility investment requirement in their portfolios. And the question is, would these institutions be potential investors in those kinds of programs that you were identifying earlier?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, I think the point that part of what I'm trying to make is, the question is investing in what, and what's the value that's part of that, and the stakeholders and the broader community, workers, environment that are benefiting from any investment, rather than where it's public or private. Because, I think we could probably all point to examples of, companies that have really been socially responsible and really tried to have, environmentally friendly supply chains and take care of their workers and be supportive of communities. And we also have examples of corporations that are, exploitative in a whole variety of different ways. And similarly, government investment that's, important for economic growth and productive, and government investment that's inefficient and, not very helpful. And so when I do say investing, and, part of that's investing in collective knowledge and the commons, and really sort of underpinning those processes of innovation, I think that has to happen, in fact, collaboratively between government and the private sector. And, I think the whole debate about market versus government, in some ways it's a very 20th century debate. I mean, it was an important debate. I'm sure it's still an important debate on, some level, but every society in the world today essentially has some mix of markets and government. And I think the more important question is, what are the values underpinning the social norms and sort of institutional regulations that shape both market and government investments and economic activity?
So Singapore and Hong Kong were cited with regard to subsidized housing. However, these are geographically small places. Are there examples more geographically aligned with the US, such as Australia, that could be used for comparisons on housing subsidy?
Yes. Well, most European countries have a much higher level of social housing than we do, and sort of looking at their efforts is really interesting. The thing that I find interesting about Hong Kong and Singapore is their mechanisms. Because part of the question is, where do you get the resources to invest in housing? And in Hong Kong, to the extent I understand it, and again, it's not a core area of my research, but I've done some reading on it, it's largely land prices, that the government owns large portions of land in Hong Kong that they're leasing to the major commercial enterprises, and using that revenue to then invest in mostly rental housing for the workforce in that area. In Singapore, it's two things that are really essential. One is they capped in the 1960s the price of land that the government would pay for essentially eminent domain. So they didn't want to allow speculation for landowners who were not improving the value of the land. If they were just holding vacant land, the government could come along at any point and take it for housing, paying the prices in the 1960s. And then they use their retirement system. In the US, we have a pay-as-you-go system, so there's no pot of money that you can then invest in mortgages or building housing. But they actually had a retirement system where it invested in a large retirement fund that then they're using that to then enable people to grow. One of the key things about both of those cases too is it's a mix between rental and home ownership, and there's actually processes where renters can move to home ownership in a place where there's mixed income and no stigma around public housing. And the other example I point to is the University of California. So we as faculty members particularly have access to subsidized housing and home ownership. And the way that works here is the government, the University of California, retains ownership of the land. And people, get access to it by signing a long-term lease, but you recognize in the house, the deed on the house too, that you're only able to sell it for a measure of essentially inflation and any improvements you put on it. So you're not benefiting from the speculation of increasing housing prices. And then the University of California also provides a subsidized mortgage system to us, where this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but the University of California has lots of accounts where we need access to the resources maybe 6 or 12 months down the road, but not tomorrow. And so you put that in a fund of money that you can then loan out to people for the interest of mortgage with monthly payments back that then can be used for those immediate needs. And so, the current rate is 2.75% for University of California employees, when the market rate is, it's coming down to that in the market, but 3.5%, 4% as well. So we can take those lessons and move them to scale at the level of the state of California, at the level of the federal government, I believe, to take those principles and apply them to our context.
Thanks, Chris. Here's another question. Some people argue that capitalism can't be reformed, but your previous work finds that some regions do business leadership is part of regional equity. And your example of growth in Ethiopia might suggest that capitalism can have beneficial effects. How does solidarity economics help us think about capitalism?
Well, there's a question in my mind of what's the goal of talking about capitalism? Because if we're talking about capitalism, there's sort of an assumption that one, there's a single entity that we can all recognize and define that's capitalism, and that there's an alternative to capitalism that we could imagine and help build. And my understanding of, well, so two things. One is, as soon as you start using terms like capitalism, it taps into an ideology frame. It gets people thinking about the world in ways that they've come to understand as capitalism versus socialism. And I'm really trying to contribute to this effort of getting a different frame. And so I actually really try not to talk about capitalism, but I will try and answer this question. And the reason why I don't is because, I find when you talk to people across the political spectrum about people's need for housing, people's need for health care and health insurance, people's desire to live in healthy bodies and healthy communities and neighborhoods when they're not worried about crime, people have common interests. And when you can talk about the processes to try and get to those common interests away from the ideology, and we know this from our research and looking at metropolitan regions across the country, tremendous examples of working across the political aisles around common interests, and examples of chambers of commerce being the advocates for investing in universal pre-K education because they recognize it'll pay off 20 years down the road. Not because, oh, that's a socialist thing to do to invest in, education. So that being said, engaging in this, there are tremendous diversities of capitalism, variety of different ways in which we combine some kind of system of private ownership and market incentives protected by the state, because the state is a critical part of capitalism, right? That lead to very different outcomes. And those variations in the mixture of government and markets and protection of private property leads to fundamentally different outcomes. And so what we're trying to get to in thinking about solidarity economics is what is the ways that values are underpinned or realized in our economy in societies across the globe, which I would argue that essentially all of them have some mix of private property and markets and government regulation and intervention. So, is there a system outside of capitalism that doesn't have protection of private property and some kind of markets? Like, people smarter than me might be able to imagine that. And it could be useful and interesting, but that's not this project. This project is really trying to understand, in the world that exists today and in the foreseeable future for me, what can we do to help improve prosperity as well as inclusion for all.
So Chris, you're saying you're a reformer rather than a revolutionary?
You know, I'm afraid that's probably accurate. I was not that way when I was 22, but radical reform, I would say.
Radical reform.
Transformative reform, even if I'm so bold.
There you go. This is what happens to us as we get older, right? Okay, so here's another question. What does the roadmap look like in moving from the capitalization takes all environment to a conscious capitalization, which I would think is similar to solidarity economics? And if it isn't the same, what are the major differences?
A conscious capitalization. So, Catherine, does that seem to be a question specifically about
Yes,
sort of resources in the economy?
A conscious capitalization. So, yeah. If you're not sure what is meant there, I can move on to another question.
Well, no, I mean, I can try. I think part of it is thinking about a roadmap of, how do we move money around, right? And how do we get money to the places that we need it? And, broadly, you can think of carrots and sticks, but I think part of that is, social norms as well, and sort of thinking about opportunities. I mean, I gave the example of Bob Geldof. I mean, he's now investing in and encourage other people to invest in Ethiopia, as well as half a dozen other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And they have a set of criteria about local ownership and stakeholder engagement, and, are quite convinced that you can make good money by having those values and investing in some of the poorer regions in the world. And, as I say, Ethiopia is the fastest growing country in the world in the last 15 years of any size, and something like 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies are in Africa. And if we look, down the road for the next 50 years, that's going to be the place of the largest growing middle class population in the world. That's where we should be working to build trade ties and connections. And I think you can translate that lesson to, low-income communities in the U.S., where they're spending much more on immediate needs and services rather than, vacations or luxury goods. And so I think there's a greater opportunity for a diversity of business and services to serve that. So I do think there are ways of trying to redirect private capital markets in ways that make more visible those opportunities. And, part of that is confronting explicitly the racism that has existed in our financial services sector, through redlining and through a whole variety of different ways of, credit scores and others of really preventing access to capital for communities of color in this country. But I think there's also a role for government as well. I'm an advocate of, some form of smart wealth tax. That I think that's we really need to be talking much more about wealth, not just income, because I think a lot of the benefits of this economy have accrued in the form that's not in the labor market, it's the financial markets. And we're not going to be able to direct those resources to where they need to be invested just through taxing income. It's really got to come through a wealth tax. And then that has to be invested smartly, right? It has to be invested in education and schooling and infrastructure and innovation. And one example I would use, just coming back to health and the coronavirus crisis, is imagine if you had trained nursing home workers and home health care workers with access to smart and intelligent mobile-based information systems that could help them in tracking the behaviors and activities of the people that they're caring for, and have easy access to help identify symptoms that may be occurring, so you could capture them early and get access to additional resources. There's all sorts of economic opportunity there that could be a site of investment in the private sector, and could be an important part of government regulation to try and redirect that. But because we have become so focused on treatment and the very sophisticated technologies that kind of, can prolong life in remarkable ways in our hospitals and in our private healthcare system, the incentives all get distorted to that side of our health system. So, that's a roadmap forward in the health field, is figuring out how to, sort of cut off the low road there and sort of pave the high road of these new innovations and really protecting everyone.
One of the things that the question, your answer brought up for me is the sort of some of the impediments to conscious capitalization, moving capital around to the places where it's most needed. Many of those impediments have to do with the history of racism and patriarchy in this country. The people who could really use the capital the most effectively are the ones who are denied it, as you were saying. And yet, do we have to sort of overcome those historical processes of subjugation and domination in order to be able to have the economy function? I mean, is this an impossible task, or is this something that together these things will move forward? We connect the economic and the cultural processes together, and that's the way that we can move solidarity economics forward.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I think they go together. And as you were talking, it reminded me of one of the most recent examples of the challenge of this is the payroll protection plan of trying to support small businesses to keep people employed. In theory, is one of the really important protection plans or stimulus plans that's come out of the federal government in the coronavirus crisis. But because it was channeled through banking sector, a private banking sector, which has that whole history of racial discrimination, meant that many of the businesses owned by people of color that are reflected in Rob Fairley's data didn't have an existing relationship with a private bank. And so if they wanted access to those resources, really struggled to get access to it, whereas the better off businesses and the bigger businesses already had those relationships and could get access overall. Whereas instead, if we had invested in and built up the Small Business Development Administration over time that could really focus on those historically marginalized communities and have those relationships already, it would have been much easier to get money to those who need it in this crisis. So, we need to be looking at, as I sort of started the talk by, of using this opportunity to analyze and understand what were our pre-existing conditions that we need to address so we're better prepared for the next pandemic, because there will be other pandemics. This was not unpredicted. There were many people, Bill Gates and others, who've been predicting a pandemic. They didn't know when, but knew it would happen. So yeah, we need to rebuild in a way that's people say build back better. We don't want to rebuild what we had. We need to recreate our economy going forward, which requires addressing those historically racist structures, as well as figuring out how to redirect resources going forward.
Yeah, it's certainly the last recession. One of the issues that people had to deal with was the stripping of equity through the subprime loans. So I could, you can understand people's hesitance to get involved with any of these institutional structures that are needed in order to capitalize new kinds of ventures. But I should go on to the next question. Let's see. Wow, lots of questions have just come in. Very interesting. And I think this might tie in with what we were just talking about. In what ways does your work drive the adaptive change needed among stakeholders with decision-making power to switch to the mindset that you discussed today? So what ways I guess it's a question about your own agency as well as a policy, as somebody, as a researcher who interacts with policymakers and through the Institute for Social Transformation. How does your work drive these kinds of adaptive changes that we need amongst our stakeholders?
Well, thank you for that question. And in terms of this project with Solidarity Economics, one of the things that we're doing is co-writing a whole series of articles with organizers, with activists, with policy advocates and others, sort of looking at how do you apply this concept of solidarity economics to address the racial wealth gap, to look at universal guaranteed income and sort of thinking about that as a solidarity dividend, and looking at high road kitchens as another policy that's being passed in the state of California that's really trying to reward restaurants that treat workers fairly, one high fair wage, and that can use the resources of the kitchen to also help provide food for people in need. And as part of that, getting access to greater investment from the state and workforce development dollars and resources. So we're co-writing a piece with Saru Jayaraman, who's head of the Restaurant Opportunity Center United, on that. And then looking at it in terms of, job guarantee, in terms of innovation policy, in terms of infrastructure and governance. So we have a whole series of planned articles that we plan to be rolling out over the next 6 to 12 months, and that'll be up again, linked to our website. And there's two motivations for that. One is, a recognition that there's an important role for publishing in peer-reviewed academic journal articles, and we continue to do that, and are going to write a book that will have sort of academic reviews as part of that, because that's important to ensure the rigor in the research and the integrity of it. But that work doesn't get read by a lot of people, sadly. And if our interest is really in, inquiry with impact, research that makes a difference in the world, we need to be thinking more systematically and systemically about communicating research results to the broader public. And part of that, I think, is also about demonstrating the importance of the university to society. I mean, sadly, we're at a point in US history where, for the first time, a majority of the American public, according to surveys, is not confident that, it doesn't have confidence in higher education as one of the institutions in society. And that's a combination of a sense of elitism, but also a concern about the rising costs of higher education and whether that's being rewarded in the labor market. So, figuring out how to communicate the research to a broader public is a key part of it. But the other half of it is that we learn from the activists and the organizers, and have learned. I mean, both Manuel and I and the others we work with have been engaged scholars our whole lives. I've been really engaged with political movements and social movements and organic intellectuals who are often way ahead of academic research in terms of their understanding of dynamics in the economy and society. And so we learn from them and figure out sort of how to systematize and articulate their insights and their lessons in a way that can be communicated to a broader audience. So that sort of engaged scholarship is an absolutely critical part of this project, both for our own learning and the broader communication to society, as well as ensuring the work has impact.
And that's why you're such a good director of the Institute.
I live what I try and help build for others too.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Let's see. Are there general strategies or resources for assessing and diagnosing regional inequality on a local level?
Yes. The National Equity Atlas is a great resource if you search for that. It's a joint project between a group called Policy Link and Manuel's organization at USC. Great resource. There's also something called Measure of America. And one of the brilliant things about Measure of America is it's really built from the Human Development Index. So it tries to get around this growth framework that people are calling me out for, to be a little more sophisticated about talking about that in our economy. And it has applied sort of this multi-dimensional framework of human development to the US as a whole, to states, to many localities as well. And both that National Equity Atlas and Measure of America have very detailed websites that have interactive elements. And National Equity Atlas allows you to customize by city or metropolitan region or state and look at a whole variety of different indicators of equity and opportunity and racial inequality. And Measure of America has many of those indicators too, but also integrates them into an index framework that can often present sort of a integrated understanding of a region in helpful ways. There are others, but those are the two that are both free, accessible on the web, and are really valuable. There's also something, by the way, an application of that National Equity Atlas to the Bay Area. So for those of you who are in Northern California, the Bay Area Equity Atlas, again, is a separate website that goes a little bit more in depth into Bay Area counties in effective ways.
And it's something that you, as a geographer, trained as a geographer, know a lot about how to find that kind of data.
And,
So
and maps. I mean, both of these have
maps.
maps as part of them, which are a really important way of communicating complex information in ways that are easier to understand and share.
I was just thinking of that when you were talking that you mentioned the Bay Area, and they have a new anti-eviction mapping project. Is that coming out of Berkeley or?
Berkeley, Karen Chappell, the Urban Displacement Project, is a professor leading that. We went to graduate school together, so I followed her career and vice versa. It's a great effort that really tries to help understand and now includes Santa Cruz County as part of that. So looking at the impact of gentrification and displacement and the racial dimensions of that are important.
So look to geographers if you want to look at what's going on at the local and tie it to the global and regional. Okay, let's see, what have we got here? Boy, there's just so many questions, Chris. You really sparked a lot of interest
I love
in your
dialogue.
Okay, can you speak generally about how sustainable urban and community development in US cities can benefit existing neighborhoods without veering toward gentrification, while recognizing that boosting the economic base certainly has potential benefits?
Yeah, great question. And I think there's two ways of doing that are really important. One is deep engagement with existing residents, right? Anytime you're trying to bring in additional resources and bring those connections, you've got to be engaging with existing residents. And part of that is because the concern about gentrification is partially about the rising housing prices, and displacement as part of that. But there's also a cultural element to it and an outsider element. And you really want to be, as you're providing opportunity for new developments, making sure that newcomers are engaging with local residents and understanding the history of the neighborhood, and and respecting and understanding longtime residents. So I would call that a social and political process. But there's also an economic reality, which is that when resources come in and become high demand, that will increase housing prices. And so there I think you need to be looking at a number of different things. One is programs to break down the barriers to home ownership. So that existing residents can actually get equity in the housing that they live in and be able to improve that over time. And I think a great thing would be to get rid of the mortgage interest deduction and the property tax deduction and invest those resources and programs into reducing barriers to down payments and home ownership, so that renters can get in. So then, if they're in neighborhoods that land prices are rising, existing residents benefit from that. The other key set of mechanisms is you got to get the land out of the market. So land trusts, publicly owned buildings and land can be a really important part of that. And it turns out, transportation agencies actually have access to, a lot of land on transportation corridors that could be made available for housing. One of the things that we're experiencing too is aging of the California population, is that many elementary schools are seeing reduced enrollment figures, and there's been examples, Santa Cruz and others, of elementary schools that have been closed and could be converted. The San Jose School District has been doing that, of converting them into rental units, and some of those are in neighborhoods that could be facing gentrification. So there are mechanisms. They're not cheap. Housing's not cheap, but not having housing is very expensive, as the figures that I pointed to show. So it's just a question of capturing that future land value in ways that can benefit existing residents.
So how you doing? Got about 6 or 7 minutes left to go.
I'm energized.
All right,
people are.
Let's go for it. Okay. Wow, this is going to ask for your predictive abilities here.
What is my crystal ball?
Got your crystal ball. What is your personal future cast of economics a year from now, once the virus is better understood and managed? That's a tricky one.
Well, and I think, so I'm not going to make any predictions based on public health and the biology of it, because it's just not my area of expertise. And, you hear various different things about, how soon we might get a vaccine or not. And, it's clear we can't go back to normal until, there's a widely available vaccine. So I don't know how long that'll that'll take. I think the answer to the question of what happens with the economics going forward depends on us. It depends on the political response and the economic response to this moment. And I have to say, amidst all the tragedies of the death and illness, and all the reminders of the racial oppression and inequality that exists in our society, I've seen tremendous signs of hope and opportunity. I mean, I think we will not see a political opening where we can really imagine fundamental shifts in our society again in our lifetimes. I mean, this could be essentially the equivalent of what led to the New Deal in the 1930s, which transformed 4 or 5 decades of U.S. growth after the Great Depression and World War II. And I think we have an opportunity in this moment to really shift the future direction of the U.S. economy. And that could be everything from a wealth tax to universal basic income to non-workplace based health, universal health insurance, greater investment in public education, invest in the University of California system and my self-service, role. I do think there's an economic benefit to that, but also community colleges and public schools, K through 12 is really important as well. But that's not going to happen just by chance, right? A crystal ball prediction depends on the play of forces in society, and it's going to depend on the level of mobilization and creativity and leadership in our society. And I think we face major political challenges in this country because of the structure of our national politics. And I will point to a series that is being organized in the fall through the University Forum that we're working to co-sponsor that'll be about politics in the US. So keep an eye out for that there will be a series of people much smarter than me on sort of the political dynamics of that who will be speaking on that. But I think that is going to shape a lot of what the economic opportunities are. But I'm quite hopeful. I tend to be an optimistic person, but I do think there are signs that over the last really 30 to 40 years, that there has been a base of organizing, a base of community connection. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement, didn't flash into being when George Floyd was killed. It was emerged and has built over the last 6 years, 7 years. And that's been an important part of creating the space that has allowed these unprecedented protests to emerge across the country. And that's what's encouraging to me is, this moment is not just this moment, it's a reflection of, the really hard work that's happened in the trenches and in the grassroots over the last, hundreds of years, but really, 30, 40 years in this state in particular, but in the country as a whole. And if we can figure out how to build on that, I think 2 years from now, we'll look at a very different country than we have today.
It was very clever of you to throw it back on us. So what's going to be the future? But I have to say, I really agree with you. Despite all the horrors of the last several months, I have this sense that we are at a moment of possibility. And maybe I'm not quite as optimistic as you, but I feel hopeful. I feel like there's a chance. We have to all play our part, though. We can't just sit back and hope someone else is doing it. So that's why talks like this are important. That's why it's really important for our audience to be engaged as they are. So thank you to our audience as well. And if anybody hasn't seen our 2 emeritus professors, Herman Gray and Angela Davis, in the fire this time, it's a webinar that they did a couple weeks ago about the protest movement. And exactly what you're talking about, how it is built, it's moving forward because it has been built on the work of people for so many years now. But they also, similar to you, they also express this sense of possibility and optimism and hope. So I don't think you're standing out there on your own. I think
I'm in good company.
I know. I think other people are having the same expectation or this feeling that there's a chance for something different. So I think it's 6:58. Can you answer something in 2 minutes?
Another one of those difficult questions.
Or maybe we could give you a chance to just say any final words or anything in the last 1 minute to go. Or
well, I'll just say again, the Institute for Social Transformation is very new. It's just finishing its second year, and the vision requires engagement from our stakeholders, and some of those are the faculty members and staff on campus. But part of that is alumni and the broader community. So would really, really welcome suggestions, ideas, questions, challenges. From any of you who are out there listening. Transform.ucsc.edu, or my email is just cbenner@ucsc.edu. Really welcome that engagement. And so we hope this is just one step along the way of strengthening our ties with the broader constituency.
And we welcome people's support, both intellectual and financial. We can use you in any way that you can help us to do the kind of work that Chris is doing, to make the changes that he's been talking about in the last hour and a half. So Chris, I want to thank you again. I think Nicole is probably going to set up a final slide for the audience, but thank you so much. It was a really great presentation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So
thank you.
Thank you both. It was really a great conversation between the two of you. And so I want to thank Professor Benner and Dean Mitchell for joining us tonight. A really interesting and timely presentation. I also like to thank all of those who joined us. It was a really engaged group tonight. We had a lot longer for Q&A and had a large group stay and ask some really great questions. So that really added to our program. So thank you. Please join us July 20th for our next university forum, The Lessons of COVID for Global and Community Health with Professor Matthew Spark. Thanks again for joining us, and good night.